Hi, everybody. I think I've met most of you at this point, but for those of you I haven't met, I'm Anna Lee, and I am the new-ish curator of photography here at the Columbus Museum of Art. I actually started around the middle of last November, so I'm coming up on the one-year anniversary. And this is the first exhibition that I'm presenting here at the museum, so I'm very excited to tell you about it. It's kind of a unique exhibition in terms of its structure and conception. And I really want to say just at the beginning that I appreciate all of you kind of being advocates for these shows, and I want to give you the information that you would like and need to be able to present them in the best light possible. So if you have questions as I'm talking or afterwards, please feel free to ask me. Sometimes I won't know the answer, but I'll try to hunt down the information for you. So the first thing I should say is that I want to break down, kind of disaggregate this title into three chunks because there's a lot of information here. The first chunk is Object Set, which is the little shorthand title for the exhibition. And then after the colon, it's Gauri, Gill's Acts of Appearance. And for most of you who haven't maybe read about the exhibition, and for most of the viewers who will be coming into the museum, this makes no sense at all. So the first part, Object Set, is a reference to the fact that the object, in this case, is a set of objects. So the set of objects is a set of photographs that were collected by the Columbus collector Neil Rector. So that is what is being presented, and it's not being presented as a group of individual photographs, but it's being presented as a set for reasons that I think will become clear by the end of my presentation. Gauri Gill is an Indian contemporary photographer. And one of the things that I would really like to make very clear about Gauri Gill is that although she was born in India, she was born in 1970, she's relatively young, she was actually trained entirely in the US out of necessity. So in India at that time, she wanted to pursue an arts degree, and photography was not an option. There was no photography program. So she had to be trained in painting and the applied arts. And then actually, in order to be trained in photography, she won a scholarship to study in New York, where she got a second BFA in photography. She went back to India. She realized she could only work as a photojournalist because art galleries at that time weren't showing fine art photography. So this is something that that in the US, we went through kind of in the 70s, right? And this was happening to her in the 90s in India, so it's a little bit behind in terms of the art market. So she worked as a photojournalist with a publication called Outlook for about 5 years, and then she came back to the US and she went to Stanford to receive her MFA in art. So she's lived in the United States for a significant period of time, and she's been trained according to, if you could say them, kind of broadly construed United States, American standards in photography. So the last little chunk is Acts of Appearance. And Acts of Appearance is actually the title of the series from which these works are drawn. So she began a series called Acts of Appearance, and I'll tell you a little bit about that in a while. And these photographs are from that series. So, logistics. There are two types of photographs. The documenta set, which again I'll explain in a little bit, is a set of 28 small photographs. And every photograph in this exhibition is a color photograph. It's an archival pigment print. And then there are 3 large photographs, and those are editioned works. So they come in editions of 7 with 1 artist proof, and so there are 3 editioned works. There are 2 overlaps, so 2 of the large editioned works have a corresponding small print in the documenta set. So you can see the print in a small size, and then you can see it in its large editioned size. And this is, I think Tyler explained it, opposite the driving forces show, where, if you'll remember, Isaac Julian was. The space does look a little bit different because I think you'll remember in the GCAC show there was a video space in the back. Part of that wall has been knocked down to create a kind of more fluid figure 8 space in the gallery. So you'll notice 2 floating walls, and then a kind of wrapped wall that goes all around the perimeter of the gallery space. Okay, so I wanted to begin with a map in order to locate you. And has anybody actually been to India before? I have not. Oh, good. Great. So maybe some of this will be a little bit more familiar to people who've traveled to India before. India is a large country, and it is divided into 36 units. It's a combination of states and union territories. And so we have this map as part of the exhibition so that people can understand when they see the word Rajasthan or Maharashtra, where that generally is. But one of the things I wanted to point out is that you see Delhi at the top. Can everybody see that? This little red section. And Johar, which is at the bottom within Maharashtra. Those two red areas are roughly the same size. Johar is actually a little bit larger than Delhi, but you'll notice the huge discrepancy in population, right? So Delhi has 16.7 million people. Johar is 140,000 or so. So Gauri Gill lives and works in Delhi, and she is coming to Johar to do this project. This is not her, this is not where she lives. This is not the area with which she is familiar. She's very much coming to do a sort of documentary practice there. And so I think one of the pitfalls is I don't want people to feel that she is documenting her own people. She is documenting a tribal people, communities of tribal people who are foreign to her, who she's interested in learning more about. And so there is a distinction between the urban environment that she's coming from, and then the rural environments that she is going to. Any questions about this map or that rough description? No? Okay. So within this region, these coastal regions of Rajasthan and Maharashtra, there are a number of Adivasi people. So Adivasi is, again, a term that most people will not be familiar with. The way that you could kind of a rough equivalence could be made between Adivasi communities in India and the Native American tribes in the US. So they tend to be protected tribes. They are people who are indigenous to the land, and they tend to live in very rural environments and to live and work off of the land. These are masks that are part of what are called Bahora celebrations in many of these Adivasi communities on the coastal regions. And so you'll notice that they are very intricately painted and carved, and these are things that are heirloom objects for tribal members. So they will be wrapped and kept from year to year and then brought out during the Bahora festivities. And although I can't pinpoint exactly which mask refers to which figure, I know that these are Hindu gods and goddesses, and they are different archetypes referring to demons and evil and good. And so when these processions happen, the play actors will actually battle each other while wearing these masks. And the masks are quite heavy, and so sometimes you'll have a small child holding the mask and then an actor kind of inhabiting the mask, and there's a little bit of play acting that goes on. So Gauri had never seen these masked festivities before until she started traveling around these rural areas. And she was really struck by this kind of play acting in an area that was struck by extreme poverty. So there is a high rate of infant mortality, there's an enormous water shortage, and there's a high rate of malnutrition. And she thought it was interesting that the things that they were celebrating were these Hindu gods and goddesses, demons, and figures that had no kind of day-to-day impactful bearing on their lives, right? And she just kind of posed as a thought experiment to some friends that she was traveling with. It would be interesting if they made masks that actually reflect the lives that they are living and the concerns that they are having and the things that they are dealing with. And she said this as an open question, not quite knowing what they were dealing with and what they would be interested in depicting. But she thought that this was something that was a provocation that she generated that she wondered if she could do anything about. These masks and the bulk of the masks in this community were made by Dharma Kadu, who is the most renowned mask maker in the region. And he is now deceased, but he has two sons, Supas and Bhagwan Dharma Kadu. And they are also mask makers that continue to make these traditional Bahora masks in the communities. So Gauri commissioned Subhas and Bhagwan to make masks that would reflect contemporary life. And it was an extremely open prompt, and she wanted the ideas and the labor to come from the community members themselves. And so ultimately it was a group of over 30 people from the community of Jawhar district in Maharashtra that started to think about, well, if I wanted a mask that reflected something about my life, what would that be? And they were really hesitant in the beginning. They said, can we see some examples? Can you give us some ideas? And she said, this project is without precedent. It really has to come from you. Just think about, are there emotions? You see masks that are happy, sad, angry. What about emotions that reside in between those emotions? What about animals that aren't dragons or tigers, but maybe a common housefly or a monkey or a dog? And she said that when she would give these suggestions to the community members, they would laugh and they would say, that's ridiculous. And then they started to think about, what could be a set of objects that they would want to represent that would be kind of unique, that would be interesting. And she was commissioning this set of masks, basically. And they started to come up with really interesting objects. So there's a water bottle that became a mask. There is a book that became a mask. A little puppy with red eyes. There is a housefly. There's a monkey. There are people that just look like people but have kind of indescribable expressions that you can't quite pinpoint, but that you've seen on people's faces before. And she was working on this project, and she wasn't quite sure where it was going to go, but they were having a lot of fun with the project, actually. And she started to talk to them about, what does it mean to wear a mask and to go about your daily life, but to act it? So I sit at my computer every day, but how do I act being at my computer and being at work at my computer? And they were thinking about this because they're not actors, they're actor volunteers. And in the process of this kind of collaborative play, ongoing play, she started to make photographs. And an interesting thing that she told me when we were talking was that the villagers were also making photographs, because this was an exciting event in the village that was happening. So they were taking photographs with their phones. And then when she brought her final prints to them, they recognized that her prints looked different from their photographs. And she felt in that moment that they respected something about the art form that she did, that maybe they didn't really have an idea of why it would be valuable for her to take those photographs in the first place. So this became a series called Acts of Appearance, and it's an ongoing series. It started in 2015. And she was invited to show a variety of work from different series at the International Art Fair Documenta, which takes place in Kassel, Germany, every 5 years. In 2017, it took place in Kassel and in Athens. I'm not actually sure why that happened, but it's just something to note. And this is an installation view of the photographs from Acts of Appearance as they appeared in Documenta. And she was kind of coaxed into presenting this series for the first time at Documenta because she didn't really feel like it was ready yet, but the curators did. And they said, will you please select a sampling of work that you think really represents key themes in the series for you. And they're going to have to be small, and they're going to have to be double hung. They have to fit on this very specific wall in Documenta, but we'll leave it up to you. We want it to have a simple frame. And she was always imagining this to be a demonstration set for collectors and for curators. So it would show themes, but then the final prints that she would get orders for from this demonstration set would be much larger, and she would have more control over the sizing of that final image. So she was choosing things that could fit on a wall and represent what she thought was most valuable about the series. So I don't know how many of you know Neil Rector. Tyler mentioned him. He is an incredibly rigorous and thoughtful collector who's become a good friend of mine, actually, and is so wonderful to talk to about collecting, why he collects what he collects, and he really, really does a lot of research, and he also allows himself to have a kind of moment of loving something and moving on based on intuition. And so he didn't know Gauri's work very well, but there was a lot of work by her in the show. He saw this particular group of work from this series that he didn't know existed, and he just thought it was amazing, and he thought it was something that he was really struck by. And first he thought, well, maybe I can order some prints from this series because I think it's fantastic. And then the more he looked at it and the more he lingered in this space, he said, I want actually this entire group of prints, this exact group of prints. So he corresponded with her and she said, okay, well, they're not for sale, but if you want to, you could have all the prints, but they would be in the formal editioned sizes. And he said, no, I want the small prints, and I want these plain wooden frames, and I want the exact prints that were at Documenta. And at that point, I think she started to think, okay, this is a kind of serious person with some conceptual backing behind his wish here, and let me correspond with him a little to see what this is all about. And I've actually reviewed the correspondence. This is exactly how it went. And he convinced her, ultimately, to just sell these prints to him. And the reasoning behind this, when I've talked to Neil, is that Neil felt that this was somebody who was going to be a significant artist for reasons that he really appreciated. He liked the project. He liked the way the project connected to other projects. He liked the work, and he wanted to preserve this moment of the series debut. And he wanted to keep it all together as part of his collection. This is not something that's very typical for collectors to do because technically these don't have value monetarily because they're not editioned. They're one-offs, right? They're demonstration prints. But they do have value kind of sentimentally and historically in that this was the series debut for this series. So Neil acquired this constellation of works, and he also purchased 2 editioned works, the large sizes, from some of the prints that were represented in the Documenta set. And his wife, Susan, selected one as well. So they have 3 large editioned works. And so when we were talking about exhibiting the works in Columbus, I said, I don't know if you would be comfortable with this, but I would actually like to show both sizes of the works because I think that it's a rare chance that people get to see how they feel in front of a smaller work and then something that's much more immersive. And it doesn't necessarily devalue the print. It does show you that they both came from a computer and they can be made small or they can be made large, but it shows you how much size impacts the power of a work as you stand in front of it. And he was down. He thought that was a great idea, and he was really open to different kinds of framings around this exhibition. This is a not great photograph. So the installation is still in progress, and I wanted to give you a real insider glimpse of what it looks like when an installation is going up. It looks a little bit crappy, but you can see the color scheme. There is gold-toned walls, and then there are very deep blue walls. And for people who have been docents here for a long time, you might not have seen the walls this dark before. My kind of conception and thinking about the aesthetics of the space was that I wanted to create a little bit of like a jewel box environment for the work because it was a collection. So all of the works that are actually on dark blue walls are part of the Documenta set, and then the works that are on the gold walls are the editioned works. So it creates a natural division. You can tell people that that's how they are meant to move around the space. Where am I here? So I'm doing a little virtual, I'm not very tech savvy, but I just pasted the what the title wall will look like once it has vinyl on top of that. So that will be the title wall, and then you'll be able to see the works on the first floating wall inside. And then when you walk inside, to the right, you'll have some information about Gauri Gill, and I've already given you some background about her education and where she has lived and traveled and worked. This is the first wall, and I wanted to focus on a couple of prints on this wall. These are all from the Documenta set. So this is a kind of lovely, a little bit whimsical print, right? Because you have a man wearing a deer mask surrounded by little baby deer. And what's interesting about this print is that the Adivasi tribal members who live in this community support themselves by making little tiny papier-mâché objects to sell in tribal stores. And they are artists, they're extremely skillful craftspeople. And one of the things that Gauri kind of bemoaned was that they were spending their days churning out these objects for tourists and not really being able to focus on any mode of self-expression. They were producing these consumer objects, and they were pleased to produce them on some level because it was generating income. But it was interesting to see that these are the deer that he's produced. He probably produces hundreds a week. And then when he is asked to come up with his own mask, he also comes up with a deer himself. But the deer looks quite different from these little baby papier-mâché deer. But it tells you a little bit about something about the structure of commerce in this village, right? This is in the center of the wall, and it's kind of a lovely image of two men walking almost possibly hand in hand down a dirt road. And the one on the left is a parrot, and on the right we have an owl. But it's interesting if you look at his T-shirt. And I'll have to come over here to read it. It says, no girlfriend, no job, come to Delhi. Okay? So it's a little bit, there's this little bit of a subversive aspect. It looks, like, oh, this is a lovely, but no girlfriend, no job, come to Delhi. It has a kind of snarkiness to it. And you think about the different kinds of self-critical aspects that these people are constantly aware of in their own lives. So now if you're imagining the space and thinking about going to the left, this is the beginning of the Documenta set presentation. And what I ended up doing, instead of creating very didactic themes, because this was something that she designed to represent a whole host of themes and connections. They're not cut and dry, and I didn't want to dictate those too much because people will see different things in different images. And so I ended up creating these loose groupings that have some sort of formal similarity or some sort of thematic similarity, but they move pretty fluidly, and then you're able to see kind of parallels across images, I think. So here we start with the water bottle, and this is a brand of water that is very popular in India. It's called Bisleri mineral water, in case anybody asks. And then if you look at, this is just a high-res image of that same photo, you'll notice that he's chosen to wear a water bottle. His shirt has a little Playboy bunny logo, and they're actually quite at a low height, so you can really see detail. When I walked Neil through the exhibition, he said, I'm noticing so much more about each photograph than I did in the Documenta presentation because each one has its space on the wall. But you'll notice that he's standing in stagnant water that's filled with trash, and there are water bottles that are floating in this stagnant water too. And so this is an area, as I mentioned, with extreme water shortages, lack of clean drinking water, and so something that looks a little comical is actually an iconic representation of a huge problem that exists in the area too. And so right next to the water bottle grouping, we have a woman pumping water from a well, and you'll see behind her is a water buffalo standing there watching her, and representations of different occupations, surgeons, and then 3 men just reading and drinking from a cup. So you have all of these different kinds of resonances across these groupings. And here we have 2 different people sewing, right? One using a modern machine and one sewing by hand. And you have a cheetah, and then you have what looks like a man, but it's actually a woman wearing a man's mask. So if you look at the wall that I showed you when you first come in, if you go to the back of that wall, this is what we're calling the map wall. So the map that I showed you will be there, and you'll be able to orient visitors according to the different geographic regions. It gives some information about Gauri's other projects, which I think are very helpful to contextualize her current work. And those black squares are actually going to be reproductions of photographs from these other series. So I wanted to show them to you so you could ask any questions about them. So these are 2 photographs from a series called Balika Mela. So Gauri was invited to produce photographs for something called a girls' fair in Rajasthan. And there was no direction given, and she thought it would be interesting to create a tent studio, photographic tent studio, and there's a long tradition of this, some of which is problematic. And she wanted to invite the girls in to pose the way that they would like to be depicted and with whom they would like to be depicted. So they could bring their friends, they could bring props, but they could choose how they would ultimately like to look in the photographs. And you see that they might not be the poses that you would think that young girls of their age would choose, but they're very empowered, and they're very dynamic poses. They tend to look very serious sometimes. And so these two will be on that map wall, as well as 2 photographs from a series called Fields of Sight. And Fields of Sight is a really interesting series. This took place in Maharashtra, the same area, the same state where Acts of Appearance took place. And Gauri had begun to become friends with a Worli painter. And Worli is a type of painting that is often done on walls. It's a kind of mural practice on rice gruel, and it's ink on rice gruel. And he's a traditional Worli painter, but he's also a contemporary artist, this man named Rajesh Van Gogh. And he was taking her around Maharashtra to places that he thought were interesting, and she was taking photographs based on his memories, and his selection of these areas is interesting. And when she went home and she looked at the contact sheets and she developed them, she noticed that they didn't really mean anything to her. It was just water and kind of barren land. And so she sent her prints to Rajesh, and she said, I wonder if you could maybe overlay some of your memories and things that you find important about these photographs just directly on top of them, just paint them with ink. And so he ended up painting Worli paintings on top of her photographs, and this became a type of collaborative practice that just preceded Acts of Appearance. So I guess one of the things is that lots of people pay lip service to the idea of collaboration, but for Gauri, it's a really, really important part of how she thinks about the initial conception of a project, how she goes about working with different people, and how she feels that people can represent themselves. And how she can participate in that, either by facilitating certain forms of representation or by collaborating with them. And so these are really beautiful works. Neil said that when he tried to actually acquire some of these works, they were completely sold out because they're one-offs. It's just one print overlaid with ink drawings. So opposite this map wall is one of the larger editioned works. This is A Boy in a Tree, and there's a quote by Gauri that we pulled from an email that she wrote to me that I thought explained her working process very well. Let me see if I can read this. She says, "The extraordinary is revered by all of us and privileged over ordinary everyday facts and experiences of our day-to-day realities, such as aging or sickness. I wish to flatten the hierarchy of human experience." So she's not just trying to bring ordinary life into view, but she says, it's great to celebrate Christmas. It's great to celebrate Bahora festivals. Why can't we also celebrate aging? Why can't we also celebrate animals that we live with every day? Why does there have to be this assumed rigid hierarchy of what is representable in the visual field? Opposite this wall are the 2 works that belong to Neil, and these are the larger editioned works, and this is the woman sewing and a teacher in a classroom. What's interesting to note to viewers about this wall is when you're facing this wall, the smaller prints are diagonally structured. So if you're facing this wall, the smaller print of this will be over here, and the smaller print of this will be over here. So it's not a visual echo right in your sightline, but if you want to reference them, they are available. And so that's kind of just a subtle thing that people might notice or might not. And here we have the teacher, and we have her 2 pupils next to her. And this is the back wall. Again, that's a drop-in, just because I couldn't fit everything inside of this frame. This is a paragraph about collaboration, and it lists actually all 30 of her collaborators for this series, and their names are in these 2 columns. A really interesting fact about Gauri's relationship to this series is that she had no idea if this would be successful. This was something that she had financed for 3 years, and she was enjoying, and she was kind of giving some money to this community that sorely needed it. This series ended up becoming extremely successful, and she started to think about how to profit share, basically. So her gallery needed a cut of the profits. She needed to reimburse herself for financing the project, but she actually ends up giving roughly 25% of the proceeds back to the community, which sounds like a great thing, but when she was thinking about the logistics of how that would be done, it was really complicated. Because first she thought, I'll give 25% back to the schools. And then that didn't actually go to any of the families who had helped her to produce this series. So then she identified a few of the families and she divided the revenue between those families. And then she told me that when she was going to the area and walking around, some of the women took her aside and said, you need to pay us separately because we're not getting money from our husbands. And she thought this is becoming extremely complicated. And so she let her gallery kind of disperse the money, and hopefully, it's an ongoing concern. But she said, it's kind of funny, but it's also a little bit sad because it shows how desperate the conditions are still. And another anecdote that she relayed, so this is a photograph that's not in the show, but these are the 2 sons of the renowned mask makers. This is Supas and Bhagwan, and they are the sun and the moon, and they're walking next to each other. Each one has privately come up to Gauri and said, you shouldn't be working with my brother. You should only work with me, And so they're trying to stab each other in the back, and there's all this kind of infighting. And she said, I've never had to direct a team of actors like this, and there's a lot of stuff going on and to manage. And then she said she showed them this photograph, and she said, you are the sun and the moon, and you have to be together, and you work together. And no, I'm not going to only work with one of you. And so, this is not all just happy. There's a lot at stake for these people who are beginning to earn a little bit of money. But it's wonderful that the proceeds will continue to support this community that is very essential to this project. And this photograph is near the collaboration wall, and these are a group of the mask makers wearing the masks. And even to talk about the collaborators is a little difficult because someone who spent 2 days just pounding paper pulp, are they the same type of collaborator as someone who saw the series entirely through from conception to final execution? But she does think of everybody as having been part of the process. So I'm very happy to answer any questions about this series. I really love, this is a very focused, it's obviously much smaller and focused than the Driving Forces show, but I think that, I hope that you will enjoy it and that visitors will enjoy it as well. I think it's a really pretty meaningful series, and it's meaningful, the work is meaningful, and then how it arrived to us is meaningful as well. So it has these multiple layers of significance. So, any questions? Yes. Gauri is unfortunately not coming to speak. Yeah, the flights were absurdly long, and she had a number of different engagements, and we just couldn't figure out how to not just have her on a 50 hours of flying for just a couple of days. So she would like to be here, but she's not going to be able to be here. Yes. Oh, sorry. Where are the masks? The masks are with her. So she initially, she had to kind of stage it like a film. So she was commissioning the production of these masks, and then so ultimately they came with her. So they're sort of in storage at her home. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, that's a great question. That is a collaboration as well. I don't think that she selects what they're going to wear, but one interesting factoid is that every single mask that has been produced is in a photograph. She didn't edit out any of the masks. If they produced a mask, whether they think it's special, whether she thinks it fits into a theme, they have all been photographed. They're not all in this show, but they all have a place in the series. Yes. Yeah, I think I'm not sure about the age range. I'd have to check on that. I think that they're roughly young to middle-aged people. There are a few older artisans as well. The occupation thing is really interesting. Like I mentioned, a lot of them are craftsmen for these local touristic tribal shops. And when she came, they knew she was coming from Delhi. And they said, "Can you get us a job in construction work in the city?" And she thought, "You are a brilliant artist. I am coming here to you because I want you to make these masks and you want to work in construction." And, so they're doing what is most lucrative for them in their village, but many of them have ambitions that revolve around earning more and trying to go out into the cities. So, yes. Yeah, and in some of the, I don't think I have any examples here, but in some of the masks, you can really see the string and then like an ear that's paper mache and then a human ear behind it, and you can see where the mouth doesn't quite line up with the mouth in the mask. Not everybody who's wearing the masks are wearing their own masks. They switched off, and you'll see some figures that are repeated. The masks it's paper that is beaten to a pulp, and then they're overlain on these kinds of bamboo stretched frames. And then there are some people who are very good at painting the faces on the masks. And so that becomes a collaborative process as well. It's not the case that one artisan will start the mask, and you'll have a group of women who are just pounding paper pulp. That's what they're doing all day. And then other people who are beginning to fabricate the masks, and other people who are painting the masks. So that's a kind of assembly line, I guess, of sorts. Yes, Jeannie.
You spoke about the deer sculpture.
Yeah.
Who wore his own deer mask. But, for example, the school teacher or the seamstress,
Yeah.
what they really did, or somebody make a mask and pose somebody in that role.
Yeah, so when I asked her about this, she said, this was very loose and casual, and people would just wear the masks they wanted to wear. They weren't thinking of these necessarily as portraits of themselves or of their own vocations. And for some people, I think certain types of play acting was interesting to them. They wanted to play a school teacher, they wanted to be an animal. And so it does not indicate their actual professions. Yes. I know that she brought the photographs to show them. I'm not sure if she left any of the photographs with them. Knowing her, I would assume that she did leave some if they wanted them, but I don't know for sure. Yes, in the back. Yeah, no, these do not appear in any Bahura processions. These masks have an entirely different purpose. I think they thought they were ridiculous in the beginning. And she really describes, they thought it was fun. It was kind of like children playing and coming up with ideas and coming up with ideas for emotions and then collaborating with each other. What does an emotion look like? How can we represent this? And you'll see a lot of masks that are just of men, just of women, just of boys. It's nothing really radical. But, you don't see masks like that in the Bohora processions. And so, no, this is an entirely separate project, just fabricated in a similar method. Yes? I think it changes their lives in the sense that they have actually gotten a significant amount of revenue. So for an artist to give a quarter of the proceeds is a pretty significant percentage. And when she was telling me about this, she said, and I only justify keeping 50% for myself because I had to finance the first 3 years of production. And I said, well, this is a lot of artists would say I keep everything that my gallery doesn't take. And so it has changed their lives a great deal in terms of what they have disposable income now. They're able to update their houses and to travel a little bit. But I don't think that the series hasn't become so famous that people are coming to Jawhar district in order to seek them out. And also, we can't really identify them. We identify their names, right? But we don't know who is who, actually, because they are all still masked. And that's deliberate. It's not, the names aren't linked to specific photographs. Yes, Carol? You know, you never know. He's not named on the collaboration wall, but you never know. And I think it's interesting, you know, because this list of characters came from these villagers that are so far away from where we live, and yet there are things that resonate with me and things that I think are very significant to have in a mask. And I think that little puppy playing with his sandals, you know, and next to the farmer, there are different ways to connect to things that are even very specific and local to this community. Any other questions? How did she get to Documenta with the work? She had about 3 or 4 other series, including, I think she might have shown work from Fields of Sight and possibly Ruined Rainbow, which is a series of accidents taken by children with vernacular. She gave them cameras, and then they would rip out the film or open up the backs, and they would get all these light leaks into the cameras, and then she would display those. And I think she also had, so she has a big archive called Notes from the Desert, and Notes from the Desert contains multiple sub-series within them. And she's an interesting artist in this way that you'll notice that many of her series are 1999 to ongoing, or 2015 to ongoing. She's very reluctant to close down a series. And so I think she had about 4 or 5 different works that were, let me see if I have this in my notes actually, that were part of Documenta. I don't have. She works in India. She works in Delhi exclusively. So she was collaborating with the 2 curators, Natasha Ginwala and Adam Szymanski, and they had come to see the work in progress, and then ultimately they gave her final say over the photographs that would be included, but they said they have to fit on this wall. So if you want to have 3 gigantic photographs, you can have 3 photographs. And she ultimately wanted to have 25 in order to show a range of themes. So, yes, Jeannie. That's not one that I'm showing, and that's something that she says is still in progress about cities. So she's working on new work as well as continuing some of the other series too. So, yes. Yeah, that was entirely drawn from his collection. So as Tyler mentioned, and I'm not sure how much he would want everyone to know about his collecting strategies, but I think a little bit of this is public knowledge that he's a very focused collector. So he might love something and see something and be really drawn to it, but unless it fits within the collecting parameters he's designed for himself, he will not collect it. And he has a very keen sense of when a collection area of his is done, when it's complete. And this is really unusual for a collector. He's not collecting for value. It's not really as much of a kind of prospecting as some other collectors, as it is for some other collectors. And for him, it's actually a lot about saving works. So sometimes it's not the most prominent artists or the artists who are getting the most buzz, but work that he thinks is really valuable for one reason or another, and he wants to preserve as part of a collection and ultimately give to an institution or have a show of these works, but he wants to make sure that they're not forgotten and they're not overlooked. And as a result, he's collected some really interesting stuff much earlier than other people have collected these. He also, he's really, he has some art historical leanings for sure, and he's constantly educating himself, reading, talking to curators at a very high level, talking to artists, listening to artists, and he wants to learn, and he's, I can't say enough good things about him. He's the real deal, and he's great. Yes? Yeah, he's very involved. He has many hobbies that he also pursues in an in-depth way, too. And he asked me if I had any hobbies, and I said, I don't think by your standards I have any hobbies. But, so. But he will be, so Neil and I are actually doing a public conversation during the opening on October 31st, and I believe Tyler and Rebecca Ebel will be doing a conversation as well. So if those of you who are intrigued by the sound of Neil and have not met him before, he will be there. So if you're not trick-or-treating and you would like to come to the museum that night, I highly encourage you to do so, and you can walk the exhibition yourself and not have to do the virtual tour. He is extremely generous. Yeah, something interesting about Neil that he told me early on that makes a lot of sense to me about him is that he came into collecting because he was basically working as a security guard. He was volunteering his time as a security guard, and I don't know if anyone here has been a security guard, but when you are charged with standing next to a work of art for a couple of hours during a shift, you notice an immense amount of things. You notice people's reactions. It's a kind of sociological survey. You notice like how annoying something is that has a sonic component, and so he just became really enamored of the power of art through that position, and he began collecting things that he could afford, which were very modest in the beginning, and it grew from there. So he had a really kind of organic evolution towards collecting. It wasn't that he just fell into a ton of resources and started to indiscriminately throw them around the art world. That's the opposite of Neil. So, yeah. Well, thanks for letting me take up some of your time, and I appreciate it.